I'm very, very happy to introduce my colleague, Kaval Ahmad, who is going to actually be leading the bulk of today's webinar, so I will let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
I work with Laura over in ScienceDocs. As they mentioned, I am a pre-award administrator, grants management. I have been doing it for more than 15 years as well. Lots of experience with NIH, some USDA, SBIRs, DoD, NSF, a wide range of both SBIR grants and also research grants. I've helped set up awards and then also manage them post-award, reporting, and then also participated in the compliance and auditing side. So as a third-party contractor coming in, reviewing institutional policies, kind of creating processes, identifying deficiencies in systems for people who are not at my academic institution, and then helping them overcome some of those things.
Great. Yeah, so Kaval's side to what we do at ScienceDocs is actually quite a new addition to our team. As you all know, we've been providing a lot of writing and editing support for many years, but that's been expanded recently into Kaval's area of expertise, which is post and pre-administrative support. So this is week 5 of the series, and as Emily said, we're going to be talking about post phase 1 management and phase 2 preparation. You all get a break from me for the bulk of today. So Kaval will be talking about the just-in-time process, the notice of award, award administration, and then I have just a couple of slides at the end with just going into a little brief detail about preparing for phase 1. So I'm going to let Kaval take over the slide deck, and she will take over for a while.
Thanks. Okay, so as we mentioned, we're going to look at, you've submitted an application, now what happens? Usually 5 to 7 months will pass and you will hear absolutely nothing from the sponsor, right? You may or may not get an email or you may not hear anything. So what do you do when you first get that email? And then what happens after that email up until pretty much closeout and phase 2? So those are some of the things we'll be covering. So just in time. What is just in time? That's right around the 5 to 7 month mark after, right? So you submit an application, you don't hear anything, and then you get an automatic email sometimes, and then sometimes you get an email from a person, the grants management specialist, that's requesting additional information. Does this mean that your grant is getting funded? No, not at all, especially if you got the auto notification from the system. NIH is famous for doing this. After all grants pass a certain process and review, there's an automatic email that goes out to both the PI and the institutional official, letting them know that we're in the just-in-time phase of the application, where they could reach out for additional information. That email comes from a robot. It looks like it comes from a robot, but people get really excited because when they receive it, they think, oh, my application's getting funded. That auto email is not indicative of funding in any way. It's really just that you've made it past the administrative review process. The email you're really looking for is the next one that comes from a person. The good thing about that auto notification, it's a good time to start collecting some of these documents and thinking about these documents, which we will get into. So again, this is the system generated versus one from GMS, which is the grants management specialist or the program official. Deadlines. So the email that comes from the system doesn't typically have a deadline. It just says, we're in the just-in-time phase. Please start working on these documents. And then it has a link to what the sponsor considers just-in-time. So what are the documents they're going to be asking for? The one that comes from the GMS or the program official, that one's going to have an actual deadline. Sometimes it's 2 days, depending on what they requested. Sometimes it's 2 weeks. The first one usually gives you more time because the document ask is bigger. The second one, if it's supplementary information, those they usually ask you to turn around within the week. Multiple revisions, completely normal. Sometimes people get freaked out because they think that, oh, I submitted the information and now I'm being requested for additional information. Did I do something wrong? Should I not have said that? With new institutions, so first-time funding opportunities, it's likely if it's your first SBIR or your first R01, probably going to have more revisions. If there's something that they just forgot to ask for, or if the reviewers ask for additional information, that might come after that first document ask comes, right? It might come in a second pull, or sometimes it may be that, you may have submitted a financial statement, like an audited financial statement or tax records, and that wasn't exactly what they're looking for, so they want some additional information. So multiple revisions during the just-in-time phase, multiple document asks, totally normal. Request for additional information, same. I had an institution where they were doing some time tracking, and since effort reporting is a really big part of what you're going to have to do in your reporting terms, the GMS had come back and asked what their time tracking was like in the system. And as soon as the company had submitted the information, they wanted to see the actual Excel doc. This company was using Excel to track their time. The sponsor wanted to see the Excel document. And then they approved that Excel document, and that basically became a reporting piece, a component of their rest of their award, that because they provided it in the beginning. So one thing to note is if you're asked for something in just in time and you provide it, please don't, have a process that you're not actually having on your end. Don't create a process just to meet the just in time requirement. Submission by AOR or IO, different sponsors call this, it's really the same person. It's either the authorized organizational representative or the institutional official. Even though the just-in-time request is sent to the PI and the IO or the AOR is copied, it is the AOR or the IO that has to actually submit the request. The request cannot go from the PI to the sponsor. So what do they request? The first document is always other support. Some sponsors call this current and pending support. They mean they're synonymous. So what they're looking for is, you submitted an application and 7 months have passed. There's probably some things that have changed along the way. First of all, do you have enough to commit to this project? If you proposed 20% effort, and something has either changed in the last 5 to 7 months, or maybe it existed before, maybe you were already 100% committed. Do you have enough effort to devote to this project? Does the entire study team have enough effort to devote to this project? So that's always the first question. What is your commitment to this project, and do you have that much room? The second part is budgetary overlap. So is there something that we are considering in this particular project that overlaps that maybe you already have some funding for? So if you submitted an application to another sponsor, or maybe internally you have funding for one of the aims of the study, should new proposal that's being considered for funding, should this really be providing 100% of the funds, or is there some overlap here? Again, you have to think that you are allowed to have overlap so long as you state it clearly. And then, especially with SBIRs, there's going to be some overlap in the aims, especially between phases, like the end of phase 1 might be right where phase 2 starts. So all of the sponsors understand that there's, not only budgetary overlap, but there's going to be some effort overlap as well. It's fine as long as you address it in your other support document. Same for scientific overlap, if any of the aims are overlapping, or if that wasn't spelled out in one of the applications, you'll want to go ahead and address it during just in time. Again, it's allowable, it just needs to be addressed. Commitment overlap. This one's a little different than whether you have enough time to devote to this project. When you've submitted an application, if you were already and we're just talking about the PI right now, just to make it easier. If you had 100% funded, so you have 3 studies where you're 20% each, and then your institution's making up for the difference, right? So what changes are you going to have to make in order to accommodate this new project? You want to go ahead and address it now, because if the sponsor decides later that they think that they're going to restrict some of your other funding and they make that decision, then it could result in budget adjustments, and you don't want that. You want to be able to go ahead and just be upfront about everything. Hey, I thought I had 100%. Now I'm going to reduce my effort 5% on this award, 5% on this award, and 10% on this award to make room for the additional 20% I'd like to devote to this new award. However you'd like to do it, you just have to address that commitment overlap. Foreign components. This is something that's been gaining a lot of traction with export control, especially with data security. All of the federal sponsors want to know exactly what your commitments are with non-domestic institutions. Do you have an adjunct appointment somewhere else? Are you regularly traveling? If you're traveling, where are you traveling? What are you sharing? Will you be sharing anything from this award? All of that has to be spelled out in your other support document, especially if there's a formal commitment with another institution, that needs to be there. If you have consulting agreements, so service agreements are also part of that. So whereas for the first really 1, 2, 3, 4 bullet points, this is really dealing with all of your domestic commitments. The foreign components is there anything else we haven't covered? It's kind of like their catch-all that's not domestic. Institutional certification. So this is the next part of just in time, right? You have other support that has to be provided for anyone that was named as key personnel in the application. And then the institute has to provide certifications. If there were human subjects or animals, then this is the time to go ahead and get the protocol approvals in place. I'd mentioned that there was an auto email that's generated by the system. That's probably the best time to start working on your protocols, because then by the time you receive what I call the real email from a person, you've already have a protocol number established, right? If you're using third party, then you've got like a process in place. It is perfectly okay to come back to the sponsor and say that we do not have a protocol in place, as long as they know that you've started the process. When that happens, you'll usually get an award that has limited restrictions on there that you can't spend any of the money until you've shown that all of the protocols are in place. But again, that's perfectly fine. Human subjects education requirement. So anyone that was named in the application that's going to be working with human subjects is required to complete either the course in city or whatever your institutional component is. There's some other third-party vendors that have the human subjects education. As long as you as the PI have verified that you know that everyone on the study has completed these courses, and that includes any subrecipients or any consultants you may have working with human subjects data, you have to maintain the education certification on your own. Sometimes whoever your IO is, they may request like proof of that if it's a certificate. So keep that in mind. Stem cells, if there were lines that you were using that you didn't identify, the sponsor will come back and ask you to sometimes identify them at this time and confirm. Genomic data, most institutions don't have a committee for this, but some sponsors are requiring the certifications up front rather than waiting during the study. And then for SBIRs, there's the funding agreement certification that not only your institution has to complete, but then any other institutions or partners that you may be working with. So for just in time, so far we have other support for all key personnel, and then your institutional certifications. Additional material. This is kind of the catch-all that everything else you could include, or they may ask for, they meaning the sponsor. So you submitted an application, we've passed 5 to 7 months, and you had a publication that was accepted that's relevant. This is a good time to put it in, right? This is like your only time to put it in because it's when the reviewer could potentially see it again. If you let them know at the just-in-time phase, the GMS will typically get it in front of the reviewers' faces or go back to the committee and let them know it's there. Other things they may ask for, a revised budget. Some institutes will not fund applications at 100% of what you originally asked for. NIH is famous for this. Some of their institutes actually will, especially with research proposals, will tend to cut off sometimes a year and give you an opportunity to change your scope and your budget. This is the time to do it. Otherwise, you are held to whatever your original deliverables were in the submission. So if you have an opportunity to renegotiate your budget, or if they're asking for it, this is a good time to get it in. Changes that you have to any of your protocol components, They meaning the sponsor, may ask for them, or you have maybe changed what your plan was going to be along the way. This is where you could bring that up and say, hey, we'd like to change the scope. We thought we were going to run these experiments on 100 mice. We're going to do them on 90 instead. Is that something that, meets your threshold of having to re-review? Reviewer comments. That is, I've had a couple of cases where, a reviewer will say, this is the first time that this company is getting an SBIR. And that's a trigger for the grants management specialist to ask for maybe audited financial statements. This applies mostly for new award recipients. If it's their first R01, if it's their first R34 SBIR, they will ask for additional documents that they typically do not ask for. The audited financial statements is one. Timesheet, like effort tracking, is another one. What their accounting system is currently like, they do ask for certain policies being in place. It could come because either a reviewer had requested this information or because you're a new award recipient. So something to just be aware of, that if they're asking for additional material, usually they'll ask for it the first time, and then after that, they won't ask for it with each subsequent award. So that's everything for just in time, right? Other support, your institutional certifications, and then additional material that may or may not be required. Any questions so far?
There are a couple in the chat, Kaval.
Oh. Okay, first question, is the institution our small business? Yes, sorry, I use those terms synonymously. Institution is always university law partners. Aren't there minimum commitment levels by PI for each SBIR, generally 50%? Yes, good question. There are. I use 20% just to kind of have ease of numbers, 20, 20, 20, right? There's a 50% requirement for SBIRs. Different institutions have different requirements. Institutions, again, companies, and then different sponsors have different requirements for the particular SBIR. So not all SBIRs are equal, but yes, the one that you may be referring to may have a 50% minimum requirement. Sorry, my ping doesn't go off when there's a new message in the chat. You're welcome. Okay, so you submitted your just-in-time information, right? We're at the 5 to 7 month mark post-submission, and then you have your notice of award. Once your just-in-time is accepted, sometimes you don't hear of anything until you receive the notice of award. That's always great. It's good to stay in touch with the GMS, but sometimes this is just how it works out. So what are the different things that are in the notice of award that you have to kind of keep a lookout for? The Federal Award Identification Number, the FAIN. All of the sponsors and all communications, you'll want to make sure that this number is there. It'll be in the notice of award, but then if you ever follow up with an email, always have your, your FAIN listed either in the subject line or somewhere in the body of the email. That way they know exactly what they're talking about. Project period, self-explanatory. Award amounts, current and future periods. So you'll see like a table that has a breakdown of, the first year of the study, what the next years of the study are going to be like, the current year that they're funding, what the next years are going to be like. And then they'll break down that into the different categories that they require you to follow reporting on, and also the direct and the indirect. The next page of the award notice is whatever the applicable regulations are. So it's really nice when the sponsors use, we're following UCFR 200, right? And then you click on UCFR 200 and you realize it's 400 pages. So yes, when University Law Partners receives an award, you are responsible for everything that's in UCFR 200. So it's usually sponsor policy, which includes UCFR 200, then anything that was in the announcement trumps sponsor policy. So if there was something specifically about, keeping track of certain checkpoints in the application. If it's in the announcement, then that would override whatever the sponsor's policy is. And then you have your award notice, which actually trumps all three. It trumps both the announcement and the sponsor's policy. So if there's something particularly in the award notice, like tracking your time, right? That was a special awarding condition that they put in there. That would trump the sponsor policy, and it would also trump whatever was in the announcement. If there's ever a time where something is conflicting, it's always good to reach out and get clarification from your grants management specialist. Because that might also be the first time that they're seeing it, and then it might be an opportunity for them to revise the award notice to add some clarification. Key personnel. So when you submit your application, you usually list, the PI, if you have co-investigators, if you have, scientific advisory consultants, and then you have people that are listed in the other column. So you have other significant contributor, other consultant, other advisor. The notice of award is going to change the definition of key personnel because it matters for what requires prior approval later on down the road. Key personnel named in the notice of award are tracked separately than key personnel that are named in the application. So when you're looking at the notice of award, there'll be a section that'll either just have the PI name at the top, would mean the PI is the only key personnel, or it might have a section that says, key personnel for this project are identified as, and it'll have a bullet point of who exactly the people are. Reporting. The notice of award will also have what your reporting requirements are. So whether you can submit reports electronically under the SNAP, which is like the quick mechanism. The quick mechanism requires annual reports submitted a certain way. There's 5 tabs that you fill out. If you are not eligible for SNAP reporting, then you do have to submit a revised budget each year. Again, this is an SBIR 1 or 2 year award, then your reporting condition might be a 2-year reporting term, right? Rather than an annual renewal, but then it also might be a mid-year report. This will be outlined in your notice of award. And then special terms and conditions. So going back to my example of the time tracking, that's the one that I like to use because it was one line in the notice of award where the company had to track their time a certain way, and it was the way that Excel that was approved back during the just-in-time phase. The sponsor had come back, for the mid-year report and said, hey, can we get an updated tracker for, the following people? And the company had used it as a way to satisfy the just-in-time requirements, but then they had to kind of go back and create 3 months worth of data that they were tracking in 2 different places, but it wasn't exactly the way that they were tracking it on their spreadsheet. So going back and having to make things fit, just keep in mind when you're telling someone that you're doing something a certain way, you've got to follow it through the entire course of the award that same way. They're looking for consistency, and especially if they're putting it in the special terms and conditions. They may not remember to ask you for it until the end, like when a report is due, but you don't want to wait until then to start keeping track of these things. So award administration, you've submitted your application, 5 to 7 months later, you've submitted your just-in-time, 2-3 months later, you've received your award notice, and now what do you do? So the first part is PMS activation, the payment management system, making sure that you're in place to actually draw down funds and to upload the reports that show the funds and how they're being spent. This is also a good time for, like sometimes when it's an SBIR, you do have the option of, rather than waiting for incurring costs and requesting reimbursements after, you have the option of prepayment, getting an advance quarterly. During award activation is when you can negotiate that with the sponsor. They do not allow it for all companies. They don't allow it once you have more than 5 to 7 SBIRs, but usually when you're a new recipient, they will work with you on this. Protocol approvals. So all of the protocols have to be approved and in place before you start the project. Sometimes some activities are allowed as part of the steering planning phase, but really we're not supposed to start any of the human subjects related side of the work until all of the protocol approvals are in place. Conflicts of interest. So if you're working with, you have to have your management plan in place, especially with your SBIR, before you start any of the work in the SBIR. So how will IP be determined as a company from anything that results from the award is very different than an individual conflict that the PI might have. That has to be addressed through a management plan beforehand. And in some cases, that management plan has to be shared with the sponsor before you can start working on the project. And then keep in mind that, as the Prime Institute, the person that's receiving the award, you're also responsible for at least being notified of the conflicts that some of your subrecipients or some of your collaborators may have. They don't need to divulge all of the details of the information to you, but you are required as the Prime to know that they have management plans in place if there are conflicts that exist. SAM registration. So you had to get this in place when you were submitting the application. You are required to keep it active throughout the course of your award. And if during the course of the award, the GMS ever logs into their system and wants, has a question about your grant and wants to see who to reach out to, they log in and they go to their contacts page. If your SAM registration is expired, there's this big red banner that comes across the top of it. So as it's approaching 30 days, there's a yellow banner, and usually they'll ignore it. But if they just happen to be logging in and they see your SAM registration is expired, you get like this nasty gram email that says you have to start all work on this project. So you want to make sure that whoever's managing that is on top of it. And start early. I've seen the renewals take, a month sometimes, and I've seen them take 2 days sometimes. This is also a good time to start issuing the contracts. So if you have subaward agreements, there's templates that are out there that you can download. Same for the independent contractor agreements. Once you have a template in place for whatever you'd like to use, you can usually recycle that same template. Same for service agreements. As soon as you have your award and you've activated and set up your account, you can go ahead and start issuing some of these things up front. And then special terms and conditions. Go ahead and review all of those and get your, get your workflow in place. If you're going to be tracking time, how are you going to be tracking time? If you're doing something that's unique to this project, what are the changes from your regular accounting system that you're going to be doing that's just for this project alone? Okay, go ahead and have the conversations and get all of that set up, get it put in writing. That way, if anyone ever comes back to you later on asking how you're doing, you're like, oh yeah, we met about this and this is what was decided. Accounting standards and CFR, I'm not going to get into because I could spend 2 hours talking just about this. What's important to know, going back to your payment management system, is that all awards are issued on a cost reimbursable basis, right? So you're incurring all of the costs up front, and then you're invoicing the sponsor to get your money back for the expenses that you incurred. Can you use that notice of award to go out and get a loan at a bank? Yeah, I mean, you have something from the government that says that they're going to pay you. Yes, you have to fill out a ton of paperwork. But you could also use the notice of award. You could get it rewritten so that you're getting an advance for 3 months rather than having to incur all of those costs on your own. So knowing that those are options and then knowing to design your systems accordingly is important. The accounting standards are always going to be the same, but like your reporting standards change, because if you're drawing down all of the funds up front for the quarter, for 6 months, however you set that up, then you're required to report in the same period. So if you're going to do a 3-month drawdown, the sponsor might require you to do 2 mid-year reports rather than no mid-year reports, because they want all of the financial reporting to line up with the programmatic reporting. Award administration tracking, right? You have the award. You're going to have reports that are due. One of the things that I always advise people is to go ahead and look at what your first report is and make sure that you have a system in place that's going to capture everything that you're responsible for reporting a year down the line. It's something you want to be aware of, and it's something you don't want to try to scramble and figure out when you have 30 days to submit a report. FFATA is the first one, the Federal Funds Accountability and Transparency Act. This was back from, I think, 2008. So anytime there's money that's moving from one tier of government into another sub-tier, the original tier is responsible for reporting. So there's a threshold for this. It used to be $25,000. It may have changed. So, appropriations will give NSF money. NSF will give one of their institutes money. The institute will give University Lab Partners money. University Lab Partners will give another lab some money to do the service agreement. So every time the threshold of 25,000 is reached, that institution, whether it's NSF, whether it's the IC at NSF, whether it's University Lab Partners, is required to go into FAFATA and report that there was a transfer of funds. This is really information that the public has access to. Anybody can go in and see how much money is moving around and where it eventually gets funneled down to. As the prime, you're responsible for reporting anything that's leaving your institution. So you're not responsible for making sure that NSF reported it or that the IC at NSF reported it, but you are responsible for making sure that you reported anything that you gave that was more than 25,000. Prior approvals. So going back to your notice of award, we had key personnel that were listed on there. If there are reductions in effort, that does require prior approval. If there are changes in certain budget categories, that also requires prior approval. When you read the uniform guidance, it'll tell you exactly what does require prior approval. It does not tell you what does not require prior approval. It's kind of silly because you have to look and see if, I want to make a change. I want to increase my effort. Does that require prior approval? Well, it won't have that in there, but it will say, well, if you're key personnel and reducing your effort, that requires prior approval. So you have to really look into the wording, and it's better to sort of, when you're reading the award notice the first time, figuring out exactly what does and doesn't require prior approval. Effort, we just talked about, that's one of them. When a PI reduces their effort, they usually can reduce to a certain amount. It's a percentage threshold without having to let anyone know, without having to notify the sponsor. If they increase their effort, again, it depends on the award, but in most cases that does not require prior approval. Performance. These are the performance reports, whether they're going to be annual, whether they're going to be semi-annual, whether they're going to be quarterly. It's good to review them. Sometimes the annual report requests information that might not be requested in a semi-annual report. So having all of, your measures in place before the report is actually due is good to review. Most sponsors like to line up their financial reporting with the performance reports. So knowing what you're tracking on the financial side, if it's going to be consistent throughout the entire term of the award is important. If you have a change in your accounting system or the way that you're tracking something, they'll notice that from one report to another, because that is something the sponsors typically do, is compare the reports. So you'll want to make sure that you have an explanation for that if that does occur. And again, special terms and conditions, designing your systems so that you're also keeping track of any of those special terms that might have been added to your notice of award. Okay, so we went over just in time, 5 to 7 months after you submitted an application, right? We went over 9 months later, you've received your award notice, you've been making progress. It was a 1-year grant, might be a 2-year grant, or a 5-year grant. Then you have closeout, right? So what do we do at closeout phase? Closeout's pretty simple. You have a final progress report. So how did everything go? Were there any aims that were not accomplished? Why not? What could have been better, worse? How are we going to end things? Then you have your final invention statement, right? What resulted IP-wise, and was it reported in their system? This does have to be signed off by whoever your licensing officer is, and the PI as well, and then uploaded in the sponsor system. Final financial report. You'll want to make sure that if you had any expenses that were happening close to the end of the award, that they're all accounted for. All of the sponsors allow at least a 30-day grace period. So if you had, you had some publications, some trips that you were going to take, you're disseminating your research findings, right? You wanted to do all of that towards the end of the study. If any of those expenses occur after the end date of the study, that would require prior approval. But if they occur before the end date and you just haven't submitted all of the expenses, the invoices for it, then that doesn't require prior approval, but you'll want to make sure that those invoices are submitted within 30 days of the end date of the grant. Some sponsors allow 60 to 90 days for your final financial report, but even though you might be allowed 90 days to submit your report, you have to close out all of the expenses 30 days within the end date of the grant. And again, the special terms and conditions. This is the catch-all for anything the sponsor might have added after the fact. Any questions? Sorry, I know I talked and talked and talked. There have to be questions.
I'm a little curious how this is all sort of done in practice. Is you mentioned like spreadsheets and Excel. Is that how a lot of small businesses go about this, or are there like softwares or things that help prepare it, or are they always doing with contractors like you guys? Or
that's a great question. You know, it entirely depends on what your needs are and what your current staff is like. You know, I've had people that have, you know, an accounting side is completely different than accounting for grants. It's, you know, like accounting for banks, it's flipped, right? So what you consider a debit in the accounting world, on the grant side, is actually considered a credit, right? It's reducing a certain account. So it depends on, one, how savvy your accounting person is. Can they quickly wrap their head around that, or like, no, I want to keep this completely separate from what we're doing? So some companies bring in people like us that will help them with that. And then some companies kind of evaluate what they have currently, you know, who their current staff is, and do they just bring somebody like a project manager on staff to administer all these pieces. I've seen it both ways. I've been pulled in during the earlier parts of an award to just help with some of that setup. And then once it's set up, maintaining that system is a lot easier. But then sometimes you still want someone who's going to remind you, hey, it's been 3 months. Remember, you've got this, this, and this coming up. So really just depends on who you have on your end that can help with this. Does that answer your question?
yeah, no, that's very helpful.
Okay, any other questions for Koval? Okay, so I've just got a couple of quick slides just to end with, just to give a little brief overview on how you would prepare for phase 2. So why is it? So as we discussed in earlier webinars, you should already have a clear plan for what you want to achieve on phase 2, and you should have formulated that while you were working on phase 1, with the caveat that I'm sorry, I have no idea why my Zoom keeps kicking me out today. Let me try that again. Okay, yes, so I was saying you should already know what you're doing in phase 1. So from the NIH's standpoint, the official purpose is to continue your research and development efforts from your phase 1 award. And you have 6 cycles after your phase 1 budget closes to submit phase 2. So a cycle being a submission deadline, which is always January, April, and September 5th. So you have basically 2 years to get all these pieces together. And the process for that is actually quite easy, because a large part of your phase 2 proposal it does include your phase 1 progress report. So your preliminary data for your phase 2 award is actually what you achieved in phase 1. So part of the work will already have been done in your closeout reports for phase 1. So the phase 2 awards are generally 1 to 3 years in duration, but it does depend on the institute and whether you're doing an SBIR or an STTR. Again, the budget is generally around 2 million, but with the same disclaimer that it does depend both on the institute, which track you're on, and also whether you have a waiver for your budget depending on your subject area. Like phase 1, there are restrictions on how much of the budget you can outsource, but it's a little more relaxed than phase 1. So as a general for phase 1, you can only outsource 1/3 of the budget. You can actually outsource a little more in phase 2. So the key considerations when you're planning your experiments for phase 2, they expect a lot more. So quite common things that people will look for when they're doing their phase 2 proposal. Reviewers will expect to see proof of efficacy if you're doing a drug or related project. You need to make it really evident that you understand your path to approval. So do you need IND type enabling studies? Would it be prudent to have a discussion with the FDA before you submit the phase 2? Often the answer to that is yes, if that's appropriate for what you're developing. If you can say in the commercialization plan that you've spoken to the FDA and that you have records of those meetings, that goes a long way towards showing that you really know what you're doing and that you have a clear path forward. So as with phase 1, the first thing that you should always do is write your specific aims page, plan this early, and as always, discuss it with the program officer and get their honest and open feedback. Phase 2, one of the two big differences from phase 1 is that the research strategy is now 12 pages rather than 6. As I mentioned, your phase 1 progress report really is your preliminary data. Sometimes people will have additional preliminary data beyond what's in phase 1, and that is, it's not expected, but it doesn't hurt you either. The other big difference is your commercialization plan. So they want to know that at the end of phase 2, you're at least getting ready for commercialization. So the major components of the commercialization plan, you will be expected to include a quite thorough market analysis. For example, if you are working on some sort of oncology drug, what else is in your space? What is available on the market right now? What's currently being developed? What's in clinical trials? And what are the pros and cons of each of those approaches? So what is your competition? You're expected to have a clear grasp of what your go-to-market risks are, and also show that you have clear risk mitigation strategies in place. You need to have, as relevant, a production and/or marketing plan, a regulatory plan, if that is relevant. You need to be able to provide a list of your IP and also your IP strategy moving forward. So NIH are not going to fund a phase 2 proposal if you don't have some form of patent protection. And they also want you to be able to maintain patents and file more patents moving forward. So you need to have a strategy. So are you going to target worldwide coverage, or are you just going to target key markets, which would in some respects be sufficient to stop a competitor trying to compete with you directly? You also need a finance plan. What do your current finances look like, and what are your 5-year projections? Do you expect to be making sales or be profitable within that time frame? Just things like that. And another thing they'll expect you to consider is what is your long-term or exit strategy? So for some companies that develop a technology, for example, in the cardiovascular space, that could be applicable to different types of technologies, such as grafts, catheters, things like that. Companies like that will often they don't have an exit strategy. Their plan would be to develop the same technology, but for a different use or indication. Whereas other companies may have a plan to develop to a certain point and then elicit interest from pharma and sell. And neither of those is bad. You just need to have a very clear plan of what your path is and how you want to achieve it. If you're going to need to partner with a medical device manufacturer, for example, it can be very helpful to have discussions with those before preparing your phase 2, because letters of support, as always, are incredibly powerful. If you're interested in getting VC funding, again, non-committal letters of support showing interest are always going to be very helpful, because it's going to show that there is really a market and viability for what you're proposing. And again, you always need to know what you're doing next. So what's your post phase 2 plan? Will it be to file documentation with the FDA, clinical trials? Again, there's no right or wrong. It's going to very much depend on what you're doing. You just need to know what you're doing and be able to clearly explain that and make the reviewers understand it very easily.